Every modern government pursues one primary macroeconomic objective above all others: economic growth. But an economy is an engine, and like any physical engine, its capacity to expand is strictly limited by the resources available to run it. To measure the output of this engine, economists use gross domestic product, or GDP. This metric represents the total monetary value of every good and service produced within a country's borders over a specific period. This chart shows the United Kingdom's long-term GDP trajectory. From 1955 onwards, we see the baseline expectation for advanced economies: continuous, persistent upward expansion. Notice the vertical axis, real GDP. This strips out inflation, tracking only the actual volume of goods produced. When you take that total real output and divide it by the size of the population, you get real GDP per capita. This serves as the standard baseline proxy for the average living standards within a nation. But an economy is not a static number printed on a chart. It is a continuous, mechanical cycle of exchange moving between the people who buy things and the businesses that make them. This diagram shows the core macroeconomic identity. Households provide labor to firms, generating income. That income is then spent on the goods those firms produce. In this closed loop, total national output mathematically equals total national income, which equals total national expenditure. Therefore, physically accelerating the velocity and expanding the volume of this circular flow is the precise mechanical definition of economic growth. The challenge for policymakers is figuring out how to force this cycle to speed up. This models the production possibility frontier. Point A shows an economy operating inefficiently. In the short term, governments generate growth by putting idle resources to work, pushing efficiency up to point B. Sustainable, long-term growth requires physically pushing productive capacity outward to point C. Governments can stimulate the economy from the demand side. By lowering income taxes, they increase disposable income, prompting consumers to buy more goods and services. However, demand alone cannot manufacture products that do not exist. Supply-side drivers are the true constraints on long-term capacity expansion. Shifting the physical boundary outward requires massive, targeted investment in new capital goods, like factories and infrastructure, alongside continuous technological progress. These supply-side investments maximize labor productivity, which is the amount of output generated per worker in a given period. Productivity acts as the ultimate multiplier for economic expansion. Shifting the production possibility frontier outward triggers a chain reaction. This expansion of physical capacity provides the foundational resources governments require to maintain societal stability. The chain reaction begins with investment. When a nation allocates capital toward advanced technology and heavy equipment, overall labor productivity rises. With better tools, workers produce more goods in the same amount of time. This efficiency directly drives down the average cost of manufacturing each unit. Lower production costs generate wider profit margins for firms. Retaining more capital incentivizes these businesses to expand their operations further. Expanding physical output requires manpower. To meet growing production targets, firms must hire more workers, which aggressively drives down the national unemployment rate. This chart demonstrates the inverse relationship between output and unemployment. Notice how the peaks in the red economic growth line almost perfectly mirror the sharp downward dips in the blue unemployment line. This surge in employment delivers an immediate fiscal impact. With a larger percentage of the population earning steady wages, the government automatically collects significantly more in income tax revenue. Simultaneously, as citizens secure their own incomes, the state is required to spend far less of its budget on social protection, such as unemployment benefits. Combining higher tax receipts with lower welfare obligations creates a fiscal surplus. The state can redirect this capital into heavy investments in public infrastructure, national health care, and public education. This state-funded investment feeds directly back into the labor pool. A healthier, more educated workforce is a more productive workforce, closing the loop and starting the cycle over again. This self-reinforcing virtuous cycle is why governments prioritize growth. Increasing national output provides the tax revenue and budget savings necessary to fund the modern state. However, this engine has limits. You cannot push the velocity of an economy indefinitely without eventually breaking other parts of the system. The first major structural conflict triggered by rapid growth is demand pull inflation. If consumer demand rises faster than the physical productive capacity of the production possibility frontier, the economy experiences severe shortages of labor and materials. Faced with excess demand they cannot physically meet, firms respond to these critical resource shortages by aggressively raising prices on consumers. The second major conflict involves the balance of payments. Rapid domestic wealth generation increases disposable income, which frequently triggers a massive consumer appetite for foreign-produced goods and services. If a nation's own export industries fail to keep pace with this surging consumption, excessive importing drains capital out of the country, leading to a severe current account deficit. Policymakers face a constant trilemma. They must balance the societal demand for high economic growth against the mechanical risks of currency devaluation and runaway inflation. The third and most inescapable conflict of rapid economic growth is environmental sustainability. Physical output expansion requires consuming finite, non-renewable resources. Digging more metals and burning more fuel generates massive negative externalities like atmospheric pollution and urban congestion. This chart illustrates the physical trade-off. Moving down the curve from point B to point A demonstrates the direct opportunity cost. An economy can only maximize consumer goods at the explicit expense of environmental resources. This brings us to a critical evaluation of how we measure success. GDP fails to capture these hidden systemic costs. The first major flaw of the metric is that GDP completely ignores income distribution and wealth inequality. A rising national GDP can mathematically coexist with entirely stagnant real wages for the vast majority of the working population, provided the wealthiest individuals capture the new income. The second flaw is that GDP cannot track the underground economy. Vast swaths of untaxed or informal transactions remain entirely invisible to official data. The third flaw is that GDP measures only the raw volume of output. It is blind to the quality, morality, or societal value of what is actually being produced. $1 million spent manufacturing military artillery shells is weighted exactly the same in GDP calculations as $1 million spent building a new pediatric hospital. Because of these severe blind spots, raw industrial output does not automatically translate to true economic development or an improved standard of living. To accurately measure actual societal progress, economists rely on alternative, composite metrics designed to look past industrial output. The primary global alternative to GDP is the Human Development Index, or HDI. The HDI forces policymakers to factor in average life expectancy and mean years of schooling right alongside raw national income. The HDI still correlates strongly with GDP because substantial tax revenue is required to fund hospitals and schools. But by including health and education outcomes, it forces a broader evaluation of human welfare. Physical capacity expansion provides the necessary fuel for a functioning society, but metrics like the HDI prove that while economic growth is the engine driving a nation forward, it is not the final destination.